Give ear, O ye pilgrims trudging through this vale of tears. Behold Once for All Delivered, a podcast wherein the pure streams of Reformed theology and the crooked paths of this earthly culture be searched out. Three godly servants, Caleb Castro, Andrew Smith, and Stephen Everett C. do wield the sword of truth, expounding that faith once for all delivered unto the saints.
Welcome to Once for All Delivered. I am Andrew Smith, a co-host of this program. I have been instructed that when a voiceover introduction is needed, I should do them because hate bad is too confusing to understand.
Verily mine heart doth lament, for I am as a lowly servant, scorned and bereft of due reverence in this sinful world.
We are continuing today a discussion on trauma. If you have not listened to part one of this discussion, The Trouble with Trauma, you will want to go back and listen to the previous episode so that you know where we are at in this discussion and where we are coming from. There's a lot of important issues in play here, issues that don't seem to get a whole lot of attention, and we hope that this talk is beneficial to you.
O wretched soul, I am sore afflicted and grievously tormented by the cruel abuses and heavy traumas that do beset me in this vale of tears.
You know, hate bad, you're a bit on the dramatic side. But anyway, here is Caleb and Stephen and I with The Trouble with Trauma, Part 2.
Sin and the effects of sin on this world and upon the flesh and on our minds and everything, are they actually normal? Or do we understand them biblically as they are, that they are parasites upon creation, that are expunged by the Lord in the kingdom's coming, in the manifestation of the kingdom? Normal in the sense of, our day-to-day effects under the fall, and yet this too shall pass. They weren't a part of the very good creation, and they shall not be a part of the perfect recreation. We need to keep that in mind, where it's like this normal only in terms of our subjective experience with them. Objectively, they shall be done away with, and all suffering shall pale in comparison as a drop in the bucket to the things which are to come for those who are in the Lord. Some people have difficulty moving on with these things in their lives. True. But the noted response of this then is psychologists can help them find constructive ways of managing their emotions. And you get two things in here. I think I did a sermon several weeks ago in stating the psychological approach is the psychological therapeutical methodology is basically you go to a psychologist because you have an unwanted feeling about something. There's something unwanted that's preventing you from being your authentic self, from living how you want to live. So this is, again, highly subjective in this way of you have an undesirable trait that has to be done away with.
Or it's causing a functional problem in your life because you haven't overcome those various issues you're dealing with, your thoughts about them.
Right. Now you need to replace them in some ways or manage them in some ways that is positive according to how you think should be positively handled, right? This is how you end up with kind of transgender affirmation as well. You want to be how you feel on the inside. So therefore, anything that is not constructive to that inner feeling in your personal goals and what you think you should be like, anything not constructive is toxic or needs to be removed, whether it's internal in yourself, a way of thinking about yourself, or external of those who are in your life and are preventing you from living this way, whether it be a church or parents or whatever. But the psychologist helps manage their emotions. And this is already anti-Christian. I think in that same sermon, I noted, like, you read this kind of definition and you get almost pretty much exact match of the doctrine of Pelagianism, the heretical doctrine of Pelagianism, where, again, it's your environment that causes you to act badly, to sin. Sin is because of your environment and what you have learned or experienced around you. And you can overcome sin and have perfection if you just replace them with the right and good actions or environment.
Well, this kind of actually, you bring up sin, and this gets to the second point I brought up, that people don't deal with their own sin. Often the way we are handling the things that were traumatic to us is to have sinful thoughts, sinful thought patterns, We're not working through what has actually happened to us, thinking Christ-like thoughts about, like what you were talking about, that there will be a vindication of all things. There will be the consummation of heaven and earth, the renewal of all things, and those who put their trust in him will receive the crown of glory and have life everlasting. That needs to center us. Well, there you go. I just used a psychological speech, but that really needs
Get
to...
out.
Yeah, okay.
You're fired.
Out. This is where we need to find our solid ground with Christ. You know, it reminded me, you were talking about trauma stuff or whatever, and anyways, the episode. But it made me think of, during COVID, a lot of people were really panicking about this idea of like the government injecting a virus into them, right? And I kind of said, I was like, okay, so what? Well, you know, if I have this thing injected into me, then, and I was like, then what? Then you've been injected with something, right? Has it taken away your place in heaven? Is the indestructible kingdom you seek destroyed? You know, why are you so fretful about this thing that may come upon you? And this is what I'm talking about often, that the thought patterns of those who have had something traumatic happen in their life are a sinful thing that need to be reevaluated in itself.
And I want to read two brief definitions. I'll leave them open-ended for thoughts and transitions. Okay. But just two more definitions from the APA. We're talking about trauma, and let's think especially, though, say about abuse, but no, we can broaden it. APA definition from their Dictionary of Psychology, this is what a victim is. Okay, one, there's two definitions here. One, an individual who is the target of another person's violent, discriminatory, harassing, or assaultive behaviors. And two, an individual who has experienced an accident or natural disaster. See victimization. I'm going to read another one now. This one is a definition for blaming the victim. A social psychological phenomenon in which individuals or groups attempt to cope with the bad things that have happened to others by assigning blame to the victim of the trauma or tragedy. Note also the distinction between a trauma and a tragedy. It's interesting. Victim blaming serves to create psychological distance between the blamer and the victim. It may rationalize a failure to intervene if the blamer was a bystander, and it creates a psychological defense for the blamer against feelings of vulnerability.
Yeah. What you essentially have happening here is not only do you have these ever expansive and almost all-inclusive definitions of abuse and trauma and things of that sort, of which everyone could probably find themselves in if they wanted to. What you also have is a system that essentially inoculates itself against criticism and questioning. If you identify as someone abused or someone traumatized, someone having undergone trauma, and if anyone dares to question the validity or the legitimacy of such a claim, or even the very categories which you have adopted, well, they're a victim blamer, they're a gaslighter, they're themselves abusers, and perpetuating further abuse and trauma by their unwillingness to accept and deal with that. It becomes very self-referential and really, again, seeks to inoculate itself from any critique and criticism. Now, I don't know if this is too abrupt of a transition, but I do want to point out, at least initially, that as you look at things according to this understanding as far as abuse and trauma, you notice that it starts to resemble some other ideologies and other issues that come up. So, for instance, Stefan made a point about, needing to focus and needing to remember eternal glory and things of that sort. And you see in this trauma-informed approach that falls into eclipse, that becomes obscured, that becomes neglected, even forgotten. But another issue as well is when you see that there is this importance of identification of oneself as abused and traumatized, and for one, sort of the immutability of this, but also the inability to accept any critique or question of it. You'll notice that this starts to parallel other things that we have talked about elsewhere and that are certainly issues that get a lot more attention. But, we look at doctrines of like critical theory and intersectionality, where basically your understanding of the world and the organization of society comes down to various classes of oppressors and the oppressed, and the need to address perceived systemic injustices among them. And one of the things with this trauma-informed approach is that it more or less imbibes a lot of the same ideologies, more or less making being a victim, being traumatized, being abused as another intersectional category, and thus importing all of the same kinds of approaches and ideas. And it's not an accident that you see people that are often pressing this trauma-informed approach to things. Not always, but often. It's the same people who have, for instance, been very insistent about pushing critical race theory and other such matters within the church. But also, this is not merely an incidental correlation. It's really sort of baked into the thing. I mentioned this document from the National Institutes of Health, and in this same paragraph where it's talking about this definition of trauma, after it provides the definition, it goes on to say trauma can affect people of every race, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, gender, psychosocial background, and geographic region. It goes on to provide some other potential events. But one of the things is that this is very much coming from like a socio-cultural perspective and looking at many of the same categories of diversity and equity and inclusion that so much affect everything else. It's also seems to be a basis for this trauma-informed approach to things, is it's looking in these similar categories of oppression and systematic injustice.
It's an interesting, we've talked a little bit about this before, and off the air, where there's this crossover and something in terms of, we'll call it social justice and as a whole. And this is a matter of, again, the oppressed. It's kind of like, it's acknowledging there are wrongs done and that something needs to be righted, which in and of itself is not bad, but the issue is the how and why. What is the basis for thinking that in this world's cultural mentality, why this is something bad? If morality is not objective, why does it matter? I'm not saying this is what I advocate, but if you follow the logic of, if morality is not actually objective, but someone undergoes something negative or bad,
or even just something they perceive as such.
So why does it matter then? And then the how do you actually deal with this then? Yeah, behavior curbing is one thing, right? Both for the victims and the victimizer, the person who does the abuse or the matter. People need to be better informed or better educated. They need to
do the work
themselves. Again, highly Pelagian as it is. I want to point out another two definitions, just one, because you used a term earlier, first of all. You used the phrase gaslight. And I think we generally have a broad concept in our society right now. That word gets used a lot, but I want to go back to that APA dictionary on gaslighting, just for specificity here, and see if we point out some of the issues in this. Gaslight, a verb. Also just the fact that they have this in the dictionary.
I was going to say that. I didn't know they would have a
dictionary of psychology.
Okay.
APA's dictionary.
I'd be curious when exactly that was added, but...
Updated 11/15/2023.
Yeah.
Most recent revision.
But I mean, just when did they actually include that term and begin to define it? Probably not something available to us now, but I'd be curious. But
so gaslight, a verb, to manipulate another person into doubting their, here, listen to that one, into doubting their perceptions, experiences, or understanding of events. The term once referred to manipulation so extreme as to induce mental illness, so you cause someone's mental illness, or to justify commitment of the gaslighted person to a psychiatric institution, but is now used more generally. It is usually considered a colloquialism, though occasionally it is seen in clinical literature, referring, for example, to the manipulative tactics associated with antisocial personality disorder. So someone who gaslights has antisocial personality disorder. Gaslighted as an adjective, from Gaslight, a 1938 stage play, and two later film adaptations, 1940 and 1944, in which a wife is nearly driven to insanity by the deceptions of her husband. So someone else is impacting how you feel, either by denial or exasperating you into doubting your perceptions, your experience, your understanding of events. One more. Now, we talk about trauma-informed care. I want to get back to that in a second here with this. But first, let's start looking at just what are solutions to trauma and to these matters. So here's a broad definition of approach for trauma management theory. Okay, a treatment program intended to alleviate, not get rid of, but alleviate the anxiety and fear, manage the anger, and enhance the interpersonal functioning, say, of, you can apply this broadly, a function of combat veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It is a sequential multi-component approach that combines A, education, in which the client is informed about the symptom chronicity, skill deficits, and extreme social maladjustment associated with PTSD. B, exposure therapy, in which the client re-experiences in imagination or through virtual reality their specific traumatic event during individually administered weekly sessions. C, programmed practice, in which the client performs exposure-related homework assigned by the therapist. And D, socio-emotional rehabilitation, in which the client participates in structured, group-administered social and emotional skill training sessions. Again, this is an example of combat PTSD. One thing that sticks out on this is it's kind of like re-immersing them in the trauma in the first place and telling you to kind of face your trauma and then work through your thoughts, re-experience or re-immerse yourself in your trauma, and then again learn how to function socially.
So let's just go do it all again. The thing that, has caused all of these problems in the first place.
Pretty much. And so this is kind of, again, this is just with combat PTSD. You see some of this, though, I think, too, in other forms of trauma therapies, though, of kind of locking, we talked about this a little bit, of locking you into that mentality almost.
Yeah. I mean, again, I wasn't here for your discussion on psychology and therapy generally, but one of the notable things about therapy and the approach to it in our day is the people that are generally advocates of it are like, they're always advocates of it and they're always getting it. Mm-hmm. For something that claims to be rehabilitative, it's like people never really end up being rehabilitated.
It works so well, I have to do it forever.
Yeah. Just an observation there, do with it what you will. Maybe to tie some of these prior points together as well. So I mentioned that this in a lot of ways reflects like other critical theories and other belief systems that pertain to looking at the world through the lens of oppression in this world. It even starts to sound in a lot of ways like liberation theology, which again has the problem of they basically take the eternal glories of Christ and replace them with a struggle for liberation from oppression in this world. And then you find most of the advocates of it are, well, they're heretics. I think we've talked some on the program previously, for instance, about James Cone and his denial of penal substitution, his denial of like eternal realities, instead replacing them with basically the whole story of religion and of redemption and of Christ even is a struggle for liberation in this world and a release from oppression. There is a risk with this trauma-informed approach that it basically falls into the same things. And I think for some people it even goes so far as to become this, because I think this is true of liberation theology. It's not Christianity. It is in fact another religion, because while it might use some of the same language and terms, it completely hollows them out and makes them about the things of this world as opposed to the things of God and the things of eternal glory and salvation from our sins. You can even see this in things like categories that have historically been attributed to sin are instead replaced with these psychological categories of trauma and oppression. Now, there seems to be reasons for this and incentives in this direction. One of the things is, let me just use an example. We see cases once in a while. There are some specific ones. I don't know that we need to get into specific ones at this point, but where there are cases where you have a man and a woman, and say the man is like in a position of some kind of professional or otherwise higher rank. It could be like, for instance, a boss and a subordinate type situation. And then a woman, and they have an affair. They commit adultery together. We have seen cases now where, even years, decades later, the woman might come forward and say, then they won't say this part, but Although it is a case of consensual adultery, rather clearly, the woman will come forward and say, well, actually, because this person was more powerful than me, because I am more oppressed and more, I guess you could say, disadvantaged than they were because they had power over me, rather than this being a case of adultery, which would involve, great sin on the part of both parties involved. Instead, I am actually a victim of abuse and trauma. And so all of these things that we have talked about thus far apply to me, where I have experienced this thing as traumatic. I am a victim, as opposed to I sinned.
Can I tie that back to your previous point about Black liberation theology and DEI and woke and all that? When I was in college, I had the pleasure or unpleasure of meeting a black man who I was good friends for a time. But it got real strange when he would start to speak to me very racist ways. And then at one point I said, "You're like the most racist person I know." He's like, "I can't be racist. I'm black." Mm-hmm. Right? This is, I have identified something of a victimhood. I'm in this category. And to that point, he's exonerated of every type of sin in that category. And just like you were saying, if you are identified as a victim, well, I'm the victim. I actually cannot be found guilty of any culpability within this scenario.
Right. Yeah, it's basically taking biblical categories of sin and redefining them to basically remove the culpability of individuals who might be able to identify themselves as abused and traumatized. And that is a very insidious thing to do. Not only is it, wrong in terms of it's not true, not only does it do an injustice because it essentially shifts the burden of the sin of two parties entirely onto one party, but it also more or less bars the person claiming the abuse and trauma from actually being brought to repentance or seeking repentance for their particular and egregious sins.
Yeah, this is making me think of, well, for one thing, I can't do a necessarily broad brush stroke here, but I mean, the implications of, well, you said in these cases where there's someone who's in a higher position of authority or power, usually we'll say a woman that consents in having sexual activity, then they'll cast the mode to the person in power as the one at fault. Not always. I don't find that there's always a blunt or explicit accusation of they raped her. That's what we have to look in, especially drawing the line of, are we talking about rape? If someone is legitimately raped, then we know where the sin lies, right? It's more clear cut in that sense. When you have something like this, where someone is feeling manipulated by someone in a higher place of authority into consenting to engage in sexual activity, to fornicate, we have to look at this in the question of, okay, well, they'll say that the individual is being groomed, right? Manipulated, groomed into it. But what we're really dealing with here is temptation. In biblical terms, the individual who is in let's say that lesser place of authority or power, the person is being tempted to engage in fornication. You don't need to engage in fornication in this sense, in this case. This is falling into temptation and committing adultery. And this is what has to be understood, say, in the case of, David and Bathsheba, right? There's a common reading now where it's, we might have talked about this on the previous episode, but David raped Bathsheba. Why? Because he was the person in power, and she couldn't just say no and object to the king because he might, engage in his fury or do something. No, Bathsheba went to the king when she was called. We're not even given explicit statements in the slightest bit in the text on anything that would indicate that it was anything but consensual. Bathsheba committed adultery with David. David committed adultery with Bathsheba. The sin lies on both ends. The psychologist's chair or psychologist's office, we were chatting about this a little bit in an article I had sent on kind of a perception of modern psychology and how much it's affected the world. It was from a New Yorker article on the cultural rise of therapy speak. And in this article, I noted how basically the author of this article casts the psychologist's chair in the mold of the modern confessional, which we know of, like, say, with Roman Catholicism, right? One person goes into a side of the confessional booth, an enclosed space with a divider between them. And on the other side is a priest who will hear them confess their sins and such and their woes. And the priest will usually then have them do an activity or something for show to do penance and will absolve, erase the individual's sin. The psychologist chair is something like a modern confessional. And early on, where Freud kind of had developed this, Freud in early psychology or psychotherapy used the psychologist chair office as a means to recover repressed emotions and thoughts that lay behind someone's actions, why they do the things they do. But the current take on the modern confessional, on the psychologist chair, is it acts as a safe space to identify someone's innate desires, to identify what they feel they're lacking, or to help them get fulfillment, to help them with their met and unmet needs. Their role in this modern confessional is to validate someone, basically, to help them discover the authentic self they were born with or who they want to be. This modern confessional, this psychological therapeutical approach for trauma care is basically largely acts in order to absolve the individual that comes to them, right? Or to have them do some kind of penitential act to obtain that absolution. It's to make them not actually the cause of their victimization or perceived victimization. This goes into then also the approach then on trauma-informed care. You have a definition there?
From that document from the NIH, when it's describing what trauma-informed care is, it says TIC is an intervention and organizational approach that focuses on how trauma may affect an individual's life and his or her response. It's old, it's 2014, so it still uses the gendered language, and his or her response to behavioral health services from prevention through treatment. There are many definitions of TIC and various models for incorporating it across organizations, but a trauma-informed approach incorporates three key elements. 1, realizing the prevalence of trauma. 2, recognizing how trauma affects all individuals involved with the program, organization, or system, including its own workforce. And 3, responding by putting this knowledge into practice. So basically, recognizing this existence and prevalence of trauma, and then applying that knowledge accordingly into everything.
Well, I think the definition finds its problems in the fact of the identity in trauma, right? Because you have to come into therapy with the understanding that this person is now this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And everything else then needs to fall into place accordingly in light of that. I do want to go back to something Caleb said a bit earlier. He mentioned the biblical account of David and Bathsheba and how that's often now discussed as a case of rape or of sexual assault, as opposed to a case of adultery. Now, I will grant, I'm currently preaching through the Fifth Commandment. One thing that, should be recognized is, yes, in cases where you have a case of a superior and an inferior in some capacity, the sin of a superior is greater because not only are they committing adultery in that case, but they're also, misusing their authority and not having proper regard for their subordinates. So there is additional sin there, but it does not in any way replace or mitigate or remove the sin of the other party. Another biblical story that strangely doesn't get talked about nearly as much in these discussions, and it goes back to what I mentioned, that this doesn't always necessarily have to be concerning women, but there's the case of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. If you remember that story from the book of Genesis, I say story, I mean it's a factual narrative historical account, but if you remember it, you have the case of Joseph. He is in Egypt. He is a slave in Egypt, a foreign slave, so legally speaking, he more or less is less than a person. He does not have agency. He has no power in this situation. He's in the service of Potiphar, and particularly, but Potiphar's wife, being Potiphar's wife, would have been the one that had the position of authority and superiority over him within that household. She would have been the second most important and powerful person in that household, whereas he was like the dregs because he was a slave. And yet in that case, she tries to seduce him, and he resists. Now, not only does he resist, he resists her advances repeatedly and then finally flees from them. One of the things that'll come up often in these discussions and, where they're trying to redefine these cases, for instance, of adultery as some kind of sexual assault or rape, they say, well, she can't resist. Well, the thing is, unless it comes to a case of like legitimate rape, people always have the ability to resist. Now, it may come at cost and loss and difficulty to themselves. And that's what you see in the case of Joseph. He resists to the point where, he ends up spending 13 years in prison as one falsely accused because he is unwilling to sin in that way. Now, yeah, that's not fair. And yeah, we don't like to consider the possibility that we may need to suffer for doing good. But one of the things that we are called to as Christians is when such a situation arises, we may have to suffer for doing good. We may have to face opposition and persecution and harm for doing what is right and for holding true to our convictions about what God has commanded us to do. I think there's very much a loss and a mitigation of that in this trauma-informed approach, because basically it takes someone who may sin or even may not sin, but it basically allows them to, under this guise of being abused or traumatized, remove all of their own moral agency and responsibility from these kinds of situations. And that's what the allure of it and the danger of it is, because it basically allows people to more or less reject clear biblical categories of sin and operate outside them under this false belief that it's really not their responsibility or it's really not their concern.
Well, this is the danger of the Freudian couch, as you said, right? They can go there, they can divulge what happened, but then there's never going to be the evaluation of the matter from all directions, including their own actions, of whether there was sin involved in that. But I think it should be admitted that sometimes, and I have a friend who is a biblical counselor, it should be admitted that often those in the church who do want to go that step, perhaps they're busy or whatever, but they do a poor job of listening to those in these situations, right? Like somebody who's on the payroll for, the psychologist, you get your hour every week, but they can be hasty to just say, well, this is the other thing. But not to sit and listen to people who have actually had these things happen. That needs to happen. But then there does come a point where the evaluation of all points happens, where we actually start to pick it apart and don't just simply, like you said, affirm the person and everything.
Yeah. And that is all the time we have for today's Once for All Delivered. We thank you for joining us. I am Andrew Smith. I've been joined here by Caleb Castro and Stefan Evertsey, and a very mopey AI robot Puritan assistant.
Though trials abound, I'm not cast down into moppish despair, but sustained by divine grace. I stand resolute in mine heart's fortitude.
We hope you will join us next time on Once for All Delivered as we continue this discussion of trauma, as well as get into other topics for your help and edification in the future.
This hath been Once for All Delivered. Seek us in the public square of X or Facebook at OFAD Podcast, or upon our digital parchment, ofadpodcast.com, where thou mayest uphold our labor with a subscription paid in good coin. Thou mayest send thy queries or godly exhortations to ofadpodcast@gmail.com. Once for All Delivered is shepherded by Caleb Castro, Andrew Smith, and Stefan Evertsey, brought forth by the labors of Andrew and Heidi Smith, and borne up by the faithful remnant of our members. We render thanks unto our founding members, Eric and Kathy Hepker. I am Hate Bad Hostilius, a humble Puritan assistant wrought by artificial intelligence, beseeching thee to join us once more for the truth of Once for All Delivered.